Your mind is not your friend. Every day, your inner voice whispers doubts, fears, and excuses that stop you before you even begin. It tells you you're not ready, not capable, not enough. And every time you listen, it steals your focus, your clarity, your future. Today, we expose that voice. Today, we silence it. And by the end of this audiobook, you will learn how to take full control of your mind, harness your attention, and act with unstoppable discipline. Stop letting yourself fail. Start mastering the voice inside your head. Chapter 1. Stop listening to your inner critic. Your inner critic is a liar. That is the first truth you must accept. It is not subtle. It is not kind. It exists to stop you. It exaggerates failure. It inflates risk. It rewires your brain to fear action. Every thought it produces is a tool of inaction. Every hesitation it causes is deliberate. Your mind is not broken. You have simply been conditioned to obey the wrong voice. That ends now. Most people fail because they listen to the wrong signals. They believe the inner voice that says, "You cannot. You are not ready. You do not deserve this." It is a script written by fear. And like any script, it can be replaced. That is the principle you must understand. You do not change your life. You change what you repeat. You have a choice. You can repeat doubt, or you can repeat disciplined action. That is the key. The inner critic thrives on repetition. Every time you hesitate, it grows stronger. Every time you indulge fear, it writes new neural pathways. That is why intensity alone fails. Radical bursts of willpower do not rewire your brain. Only consistent, repeated practice does. One act of courage, repeated daily, compounds. One act of focus, repeated daily, becomes automatic. That is how you neutralize the critic. That is how you build authority over your own mind. Begin with awareness. The moment you hear doubt, acknowledge it. Do not argue. Do not justify. Name it. Say silently, "This is the critic speaking." That is a system, a rule, a habit. Each time the voice appears, you identify it, you confront it, and you decide. You have a choice. You do not need their permission to act. You do not need the world approval. You do not need the critic to approve your action. You act anyway. Repetition is your weapon. Every time fear arises, you repeat, "I act despite fear." Do not change the words. Do not soften them. Do not delay them. Say it. Act. Move. Execute. That phrase is not a mantra. It is a structural adjustment. It retrains the brain. It strengthens the neural pathways that favor action over hesitation. That is the rule. That is the system. Observe the world. Elite athletes use this method consistently. Before every performance, they engage in self-talk. They rehearse victory phrases. They remind themselves, "I control my mind. I control my effort. I execute my plan." The result is predictable. They act under pressure. They perform despite fear. They win when others freeze. You can replicate this. It is not about talent. It is not about circumstance. It is about discipline. That is the law. Now, let's dissect why the inner critic is persuasive. It attacks three areas: your identity, your competence, and your potential. It tells you that you are not who you want to be. It tells you that you lack skill. It tells you that failure is inevitable. And when you believe it, your mind obeys. That is why training must be deliberate. You do not argue with it. You override it. You replace it. That is the system. Step 1. Stop listening to the critic as if it is a voice of authority. It is not. It is a signal to act differently. Every doubt it presents is a cue for action. When it says, "You cannot do this," you act. When it says, "You are not ready," you act. When it whispers, "Stop," you continue. You have a choice. That is the key. Step 2. Externalize it. Give the critic a name. Give it a voice. Call it the liar, call it the saboteur. Every time it speaks, identify it. Do not internalize its message. Name it. Label it. Distance yourself from it. That is the rule. That is how you prevent the critic from infiltrating your thought patterns. Step 3. Replace words with action. Every time the critic arises, do one measurable, repeatable action. If it is work you must do, complete the task immediately. If it is a conversation you must have, speak now. If it is a plan you must execute, begin today. Do not delay. Do not negotiate. That is discipline. That is power. That is control. You do not need their permission. Step 4. Use repetition to solidify the new pathway. Repeat the phrase, "I act despite fear," with every challenge. Repeat it before starting, during execution, and after completion. Repetition rewires your neural networks. Repetition beats intensity every time. One act repeated is more powerful than one act of extreme effort. That is the principle of structural adjustment. That is the principle of focus. Step 5. Record the results. Observe your performance. Note the difference between days when you obey the critic and days when you act. Keep a simple log. This system creates accountability. It reinforces the behavior. It is not emotional. It is measurable. It is predictable. That is the design of discipline. That is the blueprint of mastery. Now consider fear itself. Fear is neutral. Fear does not choose action or inaction. Fear is a signal to act with intention. The inner critic attaches judgment to fear. It says, fear is a reason not to proceed. That is a lie. Fear is your compass. It points to where growth occurs. Where fear is strongest, action must follow. That is the key. You have a choice. You act or you obey. That is the system. Remember, your inner critic will never stop. That is inevitable. You will always hear doubt. You will always feel hesitation. You will always confront fear. That is normal. That is expected. What is not optional is your response. You do not debate it. You do not negotiate with it. You do not appease it. You act. You repeat. You reinforce. You strengthen your pathways for focus, for clarity, for execution. You have a choice. You act. That is discipline. Finally, integrate this into a daily structure. Begin each day with identification of your critic. Repeat the phrase, "I act despite fear," at least 3 times before any significant task. Execute a single measurable action immediately after. Observe the result. Repeat this system each day. The critic will weaken. Your neural patterns will strengthen. Action becomes automatic. Fear loses authority. You have reclaimed control. You do not need their permission. You have a choice. That is the key. This is not a motivational exercise. It is training. It is conditioning. It is deliberate practice. Your mind is your domain. Your attention is your power. The inner critic will always attempt to seize it. You will always override it. You do not change your life. You change what you repeat. That is the rule. That is the system. That is the law. With this foundation established, you are prepared to advance. The next chapter will teach you how to name the saboteur, externalize it fully, and implement systems that prevent it from ever taking authority over your thoughts again. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act on it. Chapter 2. Name the saboteur. Awareness is the foundation of control. You cannot defeat what you cannot see. You cannot redirect what you do not identify. That is the principle. Your inner critic is persistent because it is anonymous. It hides behind uncertainty, doubt, and fear. It attacks silently, without form, without face, without accountability. You act. You pause. You hesitate. You obey. This is what has been happening. It ends now. The first step in controlling the inner critic is simple. Give a name. Give it a face. Make it visible. Do not underestimate this act. Recognition converts chaos into structure. Recognition converts emotion into observation. Recognition converts passivity into agency. Awareness is not enough. Awareness combined with labeling is the system. You have a choice. You name it, or it names you. That is the key. When you give the critic a name, you externalize it. You separate the destructive voice from your identity. You acknowledge, this is not me. This is a pattern. This is a saboteur. Without a label, the voice remains an invisible tyrant. It infiltrates every decision. It whispers doubts in every interaction. It clouds every judgment. Naming it is the act of containment. That is the rule. That is the principle. That is the system. Consider writers and entrepreneurs. High performers across disciplines use this exact method. They label negative thoughts to prevent emotional escalation. They call the voice the saboteur. They call it the gremlin. They call it the critic. Every time it emerges, they say silently, "Not today, name." The phrase is simple. The phrase is repetitive. The phrase is a structural adjustment. It interrupts the automatic pattern of fear. It stops the hijack before it starts. You have a choice. You do not need permission. You do not need validation. You act. That is the key. The mechanics are deliberate. Step 1. Identify the moment doubt appears. Notice the thought, the hesitation, the impulse to stop. Step 2. Name it. Assign a label. Give a voice. Make it tangible. Step 3. Confront it. Say it silently. "Not today, Nick." Step 4. Execute an immediate, measurable action. Pick one. Perform it. Repeat it. Reinforce it. These 4 steps create a system. A system that transforms the invisible saboteur into a manageable variable. You have a choice. That is the law. Repetition strengthens this system. Every time the voice appears, you repeat the phrase. Every time hesitation strikes, you repeat the phrase. Every time fear surfaces, you repeat the phrase. "Not today." This is not a suggestion. This is a rule. This is a habit. This is conditioning. Each repetition rewires your neural pathways. Each repetition converts fear into action. Each repetition strengthens control over your mind. That is the principle. That is the process. That is the design. Observe the saboteur carefully. Track its patterns. Identify the situations in which it emerges. Is it during decision-making? Is it during creation? Is it during confrontation? Map it. Record it. Name the specific triggers. Without analysis, the saboteur remains unpredictable. With analysis, it becomes a system you can counter. You have a choice. You do not obey. You control. That is the key. Naming the saboteur is not an act of weakness. It is an act of authority. It is not an admission of failure. It is an application of discipline. Discipline requires structure. Structure requires rules. Rules require observation. Observation requires naming. Do not skip steps. Do not rationalize. Do not negotiate. The voice will always resist. That is expected. That is normal. That is why this system exists. You have a choice. Act. That is the law. The method is simple, but consistency is non-negotiable. You will hear the voice dozens of times each day. Each emergence is an opportunity to reinforce control. Each emergence is a test. You must respond immediately. You do not debate it. You do not appease it. You name it. You confront it. You act. You repeat. Not today, name. That is the mantra. That is the rule. That is the structure. You will make mistakes. You will falter. You will forget the phrase. That is normal. Training is iterative. That is the design. What matters is the next moment. In the next emergence, repeat the system. Observe. Name. Confront. Act. Repeat. Every repetition compounds. Every repetition strengthens. Every repetition reduces the power of the critic. That is the system. That is discipline. That is mastery. Externalization prevents internal chaos. When the critic is abstract, it is overwhelming. When the critic is named, it is manageable. When it is manageable, it is controllable. That is why elite performers practice this. That is why great thinkers, writers, and creators implement this habit. It is a system. It is measurable. It is repeatable. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey. That is the key. Integrate this into your daily routine. Begin with awareness. Identify your critic at the start of the day. Assign a label. Repeat the phrase. Take immediate action. Reinforce the habit at least 3 times daily. Review results each evening. Adjust naming if necessary. Track triggers. Optimize response. This is training. This is conditioning. This is mastery in motion. You have a choice. You do not need permission. You execute. That is the law. The voice will attempt to return with subtlety. It will try to reclaim authority. It will try to mask itself as doubt, caution, or reason. Do not let it. Observe. Name. Confront. Act. Repeat. Consistency over intensity. Repetition over heroics. This is the system that transforms fear into action. This is the system that neutralizes the saboteur. This is the system that allows you to reclaim your mind. You have a choice. That is the key. Finally, understand this. You do not eliminate the inner critic entirely. That is impossible. It will always exist. What changes is your relationship with it. You no longer obey. You no longer hesitate. You now have a system. You now have a method. You now have control. Every named voice is a contained variable. Every repetition strengthens authority. Every action overrides fear. You do not change your life. You change what you repeat. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. With the saboteur named, with a system in place, you are prepared for the next level. The next chapter will teach you how to silence the mental noise, how to create intentional space for clarity, and how to execute with focus without surrendering to distraction. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 3. Silence the mental noise. Most of your day is lost. Lost to distraction. Lost to noise. Social media. Emails. Alerts. Messages. News. Every ping steals your attention. Every scroll fragments your focus. Every moment of unplanned stimulation trains your brain to wander. That is the truth. That is why most fail. That is why most never achieve sustained clarity. You have a choice. You can surrender your attention or you can reclaim it. That is the key. The mind is a finite resource. Every task, every decision, every thought consumes it. When noise dominates, attention is scattered. Productivity collapses. Ideas stagnate. Creativity dries up. Mental energy is wasted. That is why control over your environment is non-negotiable. Discipline begins with what you allow into your awareness. You have a choice. You decide. That is the principle. Intentional silence is not optional. It is a system. It is a practice. It is a tool. Schedule it. Block 20 minutes each day. Alone. No phone. No notifications. No interruptions. No external input. That is all. 20 minutes. That is enough to reset your mental circuits. That is enough to restore focus. That is enough to strengthen clarity. Repeat it daily. Repeat it without fail. Repeat it without compromise. Repetition builds neural pathways. That is the law. That is the system. Begin with awareness of noise. Observe the chatter in your mind. Notice the internal commentary. Notice the impulse to check your phone. Notice the urge to respond immediately. Do not judge yourself. Do not react. Label it. Name it. Externalize it. That is a system. That is a discipline. That is how clarity is born. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey. That is the key. The purpose of silence is simple. Control your attention. Remove all inputs. Observe your mind. Identify patterns of distraction. Understand triggers. Notice when your focus drifts. Notice what causes it. Without this understanding, discipline is random. With this understanding, discipline is deliberate. That is the difference between reaction and control. That is the rule. That is the structure. That is the system. Use a physical space to reinforce the habit. Sit in a quiet room, eyes open or closed, as you prefer. Place your phone out of reach. Turn off notifications. Eliminate external stimuli. The environment reinforces the mind. That is the design principle. Structure creates automatic compliance. Structure removes decision fatigue. Structure strengthens attention. That is the key. You have a choice. You do not need permission. You act. That is discipline. During the silence, focus on nothing but presence. Do not plan. Do not worry. Do not analyze. Observe thoughts as they arise. Label them. Let them pass. Return attention to stillness. This is training. This is mental exercise. This is discipline in action. Your inner critic may attempt intrusion. Label it. Say silently, "Not today," and aim. Return to quiet. Each intrusion is an opportunity to reinforce control. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Repetition is the core of this practice. Daily, 20 minutes alone, uninterrupted. Label distractions. Observe patterns. Return to stillness. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Quiet creates clarity. Clarity creates power. Say it at the start. Say it mid-session. Say it at the end. Embed it. Internalize it. Reinforce it. That is the system. That is the law. That is the blueprint. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Notice the impact. After days, clarity emerges. Mental noise diminishes. Focus improves. Decisions are sharper. Energy is preserved. Creativity returns. Emotional response is slow. Observation strengthens. This is not coincidence. This is system. This is habit. This is discipline. This is power. You have a choice. You act. You repeat. That is the principle. That is the process. That is the design. Silence also protects against external manipulation. Every notification, every alert, every incoming demand fragments the mind. Without boundaries, you're subject to every stimulus. Control over attention is control over life. You must impose limits. You must enforce them. Turn off devices. Close unnecessary tabs. Create a buffer between yourself and intrusion. 20 minutes is the minimum. Longer is acceptable. Make it non-negotiable. Repeat daily. Repeat without exception. You have a choice. You act. That is the system. That is the law. Now, integrate this practice into your broader routine. Begin with silence. End with reflection. Before meetings, before writing, before any task requiring focus. Allow the mind to settle. Allow clarity to emerge. Allow intention to guide action. Silence is the prerequisite for execution. Silence is not passive. Silence is active preparation. Repeat. Reinforce. Strengthen. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. Remember, silence is not an escape. It is not avoidance. It is training. It is conditioning. It is deliberate practice of attention. It is a tool for mastering the mind. You do not need the world's approval. You do not need validation. You do not need permission. You act. You repeat. You reinforce. You strengthen. Quiet creates clarity. Clarity creates power. That is the mantra. That is the rule. That is the system. You have a choice. That is the key. Finally, understand this. Mental noise will always return. Alerts will ping. Conversations will interrupt. Thoughts will intrude. That is inevitable. What is not optional is your response. You have a system. You have a structure. You have repetition. You have rules. You create silence. You control attention. You reclaim power. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. With this foundation established, you are prepared to advance. The next chapter will teach you how to identify the trigger thoughts that spark distraction and fear, how to anticipate them, and how to respond with immediate, repeatable action. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 4. Identify the trigger thoughts. Self-sabotage is not random. It is predictable. It follows patterns. It follows triggers. Every hesitation, every moment of doubt, every act of procrastination is the mind's automatic response to certain stimuli. If you do not recognize the triggers, you will remain subject to them. That ends now. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey. That is the principle. Triggers are specific. They are situations, thoughts, or environments that ignite fear, doubt, or hesitation. A student faces a test and thinks, "I'm not smart enough." A writer opens a blank page and hears, "No one will read this." A professional starts a project and feels, "I will fail." Each trigger activates the inner critic. Each trigger initiates the self-sabotage loop. Awareness of the trigger is your first weapon. That is the law. That is the rule. That is the system. Step 1. Observe your behavior. Note every moment you hesitate. Note every thought that stops action. Identify patterns. Is procrastination constant in certain tasks? Is fear strongest in specific situations? Map them. Write them down. Record them. Without recording, patterns remain invisible. With recording, patterns become systems you can control. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 2. Recognize the thought when the trigger occurs. Don't argue with it. Don't rationalize it. Don't justify it. Label it. Internally say, "Trigger recognized. Focus regained." That is your mantra. That is your structural adjustment. That interrupts the automatic response. That halts the critic. That restores control. Repeat it. Every time. Without exception. That is discipline. That is power. That is authority over your mind. Step 3. Pair recognition with immediate action. The mind cannot maintain focus while waiting to act. Action consolidates control. If the trigger is fear of failure on a task, start the task immediately. If the trigger is hesitation in a conversation, speak first. If the trigger is doubt during creation, begin. Do not debate. Do not analyze endlessly. Act. Repeat. Reinforce. That is the system. That is the rule. That is the law. Triggers are not weaknesses. They are signals. They indicate where attention is most necessary. They mark the edge of growth. Where the trigger is strongest, action must follow. That is the law of self-mastery. Avoidance strengthens the critic. Obedience to the trigger trains the brain for inaction. Recognition and response train the brain for control. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. Examples illustrate the system. Consider the student. Every test triggers, "I'm not smart enough." Previously, this thought stopped study sessions, prompted procrastination, and created anxiety. Now, the student recognizes the trigger. Trigger recognized. Focus regained. Immediately, the student opens the textbook, begins review, and breaks the pattern. Over time, the brain associates tests with action, not fear. Repetition converts fear into control. That is structural adjustment. That is discipline. That is mastery. The method is universal. Identify triggers in work. Identify triggers in relationships. Identify triggers in creativity. Identify triggers in physical training. Any domain is subject to pattern recognition. Any domain is subject to control. The more comprehensive your awareness, the stronger your authority over the inner critic. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Observe the environment. Certain stimuli consistently provoke self-doubt. Specific apps, certain conversations, particular locations, certain people. Identify them, map them, structure your responses. Either avoid unnecessary exposure or prepare a pre-designed reaction. Both are systems. Both are discipline. Both reinforce control. That is the rule. That is the law. That is the system. Repetition is essential. Each time a trigger appears, repeat the mantra, trigger recognized, focus regained. Say it silently. Say it aloud if necessary. Pair it with action. Repeat the cycle multiple times daily. Consistency compounds. Automatic control replaces reactive fear. Neural pathways strengthen. Habits solidify. Self-mastery is achieved. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. Training your mind to recognize triggers also prevents escalation. Without recognition, the inner critic amplifies. Doubt becomes fear. Fear becomes paralysis. Paralysis becomes failure. Recognition halts the cascade. It interrupts the pattern before it escalates. It converts potential collapse into action. That is the system. That is the rule. That is the blueprint. Do not underestimate subtle triggers. Small cues often initiate the strongest responses. A single thought, a glance at social media, a negative comment, a fleeting memory. Each is a trigger if unrecognized. Each can be neutralized with the mantra, trigger recognized. Focus regained. Repetition prevents escalation. Repetition converts subtle cues into actionable intelligence. That is training. That is discipline. That is control. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Integrate this system into daily practice. Begin the day by reviewing known triggers. Mentally rehearse the mantra for each. During the day, remain vigilant for emergent triggers. Repeat the mantra. Take immediate action. Log results at the end of the day. Review patterns. Refine response. This is not optional. This is structural training. This is conditioning. This is mastery in practice. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Finally, understand this. Triggers will always exist. Fear will always appear. Doubt will always arise. That is inevitable. What is not optional is your response. You have a system. You have a mantra. You have action. You have repetition. You have control. You do not change your life. You change what you repeat. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. With triggers identified, you are prepared to move forward. The next chapter will teach you how to replace excuses with systems, how to convert hesitation into structured action, and how to ensure that every decision reinforces your discipline rather than your fear. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 5. Replace excuses with systems. Excuses are the fuel of your inner critic. Every rationalization, every justification, every "I'll do it later," each one strengthens hesitation. Each one reinforces fear. Excuses are the mechanism by which the inner critic maintains control. That is the truth. That is why change rarely occurs through willpower alone. That ends now. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey. That is the principle. Systems are the antidote. Systems remove reliance on motivation. Systems remove reliance on perfect timing. Systems remove reliance on emotion. Systems create automatic responses. Systems convert action into habit. Systems override excuses. That is the law. That is the rule. That is the system. Repeat after me silently. System first. Excuse last. Say it with intention. Say it with discipline. Say it every time hesitation arises. Step 1. Identify your common excuses. Be precise. Do not generalize. Do not rationalize. Identify. I don't have time. I'm too tired. I will do it tomorrow. Every excuse has a trigger. Every excuse has a pattern. Write them down. Map them. That is step 1. That is structural awareness. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 2. Design a system that eliminates the need for excuses. Use small, repeatable actions. Break large tasks into consistent, manageable steps. Focus on frequency over intensity. One action repeated consistently is stronger than sporadic effort. James Clear demonstrates this with habit stacking. Small actions executed consistently compound into extraordinary results. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 3. Pair the system with immediate execution. Do not debate whether conditions are perfect. Do not wait for inspiration. Do not negotiate with the critic. Act within the framework of your system. Let the rules enforce compliance. Let structure dictate behavior. Excuses cannot survive in a structured environment. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 4. Create environmental cues to reinforce the system. Place reminders where action occurs. Visual triggers. Notes. Alarms. Physical placement of tools. Each cue strengthens the neural pathway for execution. Each cue reduces the probability of hesitation. Each cue converts repetition into automatic response. That is structural design. That is discipline. That is control. Repeat the mantra, system first. Excuse last. Every day, every task, every action. Excuses are seductive. They appeal to logic. They appeal to comfort. They appeal to perceived fairness. But comfort does not build mastery. Logic does not build discipline. Fairness does not build focus. Action builds mastery. Repetition builds discipline. Structure builds control. Systems convert intention into reality. Excuses maintain stagnation. That is the distinction. That is the law. That is the principle. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Real-world examples illustrate this principle. A writer may say, I have no time to write. Excuse. Implement a system. 20 minutes every morning, no exceptions. Repeat daily. Output grows. Skill accumulates. Confidence strengthens. Fear diminishes. Habit overrides hesitation. Action becomes automatic. Excuse eliminated. The system enforces execution. That is structural adjustment. That is discipline. That is mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Another example. A student may procrastinate on study sessions. Excuse, I am too tired. System, a fixed schedule of short, focused study sessions immediately after waking. No exceptions. No debate. Action occurs. The brain adapts. Performance improves. Motivation becomes irrelevant. Excuse disappears. System enforces behavior. Repeat. 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 System first. Excuse last. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 5. Monitor and adjust. Systems are not static. Identify failures. Observe breakdowns. Adjust structure. Strengthen rules. Reinforce repetition. Excuses will attempt resurgence. They are persistent. You are persistent. Your system adapts. Your system enforces compliance. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Consistency over intensity is the rule. Radical effort without structure fails. Sporadic bursts of willpower are temporary. Systems create permanent change. Repetition beats heroics. Frequency over force. Discipline over motivation. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Repeat silently. System first. Excuse last. Embed it. Internalize it. Act on it. Use accountability to reinforce the system. Report progress. Track actions. Measure compliance. External observation strengthens internal discipline. Systems plus accountability equals structural mastery. Excuses cannot survive. Hesitation cannot survive. The inner critic loses authority. You gain control. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Do not allow exceptions to become habits. One compromise today leads to multiple compromises tomorrow. Enforce rules rigorously. Every action must align with the system. Every task must follow the structure. No debate, no negotiation, no justification. Action is the only acceptable response. Repeat. System first. Excuse last. That is structural training. That is conditioning. That is mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Finally, understand this. Life will always offer reasons to avoid action. There will always be obstacles. There will always be discomfort. There will always be competing priorities. Excuses are natural. Systems are deliberate. Systems enforce compliance without debate. Systems convert intention into measurable outcomes. Systems neutralize fear, doubt, and hesitation. You do not change your life. You change what you repeat. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. With systems replacing excuses, you're prepared for the next chapter. The next chapter will teach you how to build daily micro-discipline, how to train your focus like a muscle, and how to compound small actions into unstoppable momentum. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the principle. Chapter 6. Build daily micro-discipline. Focus is a muscle. That is the principle. Muscles do not grow from occasional exertion. Muscles grow from repeated, deliberate stress. The mind is the same. Attention does not strengthen through randomness. Attention grows through consistent daily practice. That is the law. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey distraction. That is the key. Most people overestimate intensity and underestimate consistency. They attempt long hours, radical change, or extreme effort. These bursts are unsustainable. They collapse. Momentum is lost. Habits are broken. Microdiscipline avoids this. Small, repeatable actions daily compound into extraordinary control. One focused act, repeated every day, exceeds the impact of sporadic heroics. That is the rule. That is the design. That is the system. Step 1. Identify a task that requires attention. It can be reading, writing, coding, planning, or learning. Choose one. Only one. Complexity reduces compliance. Simplicity enforces repetition. 10 minutes is sufficient. 10 minutes every day. No exceptions. That is structural discipline. That is authority over your mind. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 2. Schedule the practice. Same time. Every day. Morning is preferable. Morning sets the tone for all subsequent action. Remove distractions. Place your phone out of reach. Silence notifications. Isolate the environment. This is not optional. Structure enforces compliance. Structure strengthens repetition. Structure trains focus. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. Step 3. Execute with full attention. 10 minutes of distraction-free engagement. Observe the mind. Notice impulses to wander. Label them. Return to the task. Each interruption is an opportunity to reinforce control. Each return is a neural strengthening exercise. Repetition creates automaticity. Automaticity converts effort into habit. Habit eliminates hesitation. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Repeat. Discipline today equals freedom tomorrow. Step 4. Track progress. Record completion each day. Observe consistency. Do not focus on perfection. Focus on repetition. Consistency compounds. Momentum builds. The brain associates focus with routine. Focus becomes automatic. Discipline becomes habitual. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Consider the compounding effect. 10 minutes daily equals 70 minutes weekly. 300 minutes monthly. Over months, control over attention improves dramatically. Tasks that once required willpower now occur automatically. Creativity emerges. Efficiency increases. Fear diminishes. Hesitation disappears. Discipline today creates freedom tomorrow. That is the principle. That is the rule. That is the system. Microdiscipline is domain independent. Apply it to work. Apply it to study. Apply it to creativity. Apply it to physical training. Apply it to personal organization. The principle remains identical. Small, repeated, consistent action overrides the inner critic. Small, repeated, consistent action strengthens focus. Small, repeated, consistent action builds authority over your mind. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. The key obstacle is resistance. Every day, the mind will seek comfort. It will suggest excuses. You are too tired. You will do it later. It is not urgent. Ignore it. The system exists to enforce compliance. Follow the steps. Execute. Repeat. Repetition beats rationalization. Discipline beats hesitation. Focus grows. Authority over action strengthens. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 5. Expand gradually. Once 10 minutes is consistent. Add additional tasks or extend duration. Incrementally. Never sudden. Never radical. Growth compounds through structure. Growth compounds through repetition. Avoid overextension. Avoid heroics. Avoid reliance on motivation. Microdiscipline does not depend on emotion. It depends on design. That is the rule. That is the law. That is the system. Repeat silently. Discipline today equals freedom tomorrow. Observe results. 10 minutes daily trains focus. Focus allows deep work. Deep work builds competence. Competence builds confidence. Confidence strengthens execution. Execution reinforces microdiscipline. The cycle compounds. Momentum becomes inevitable. Fear diminishes. Hesitation disappears. The inner critic loses power. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Repetition is non-negotiable. Discipline is habitual. Avoid skipping days. Missing one day trains the brain for weakness. Missing one day weakens authority. Consistency over intensity is mandatory. Always. Daily execution, even if imperfect, exceeds sporadic perfection. Build momentum. Protect it. Strengthen it. That is structural training. That is conditioning. That is mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. Microdiscipline also protects against overwhelm. Large tasks, distant goals, and high expectations often paralyze action. Microdiscipline reduces complexity. One small action, one focus period, one repetition. The system converts large, abstract tasks into manageable, actionable units. Control replaces fear. Authority replaces hesitation. Action replaces doubt. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Finally, internalize the mantra. Repeat it during each session. Repeat it when resistance arises. Repeat it as reinforcement. Discipline today equals freedom tomorrow. Embed it. Internalize it. Let it guide action. Let it enforce compliance. Let it convert effort into habit. Let it transform fear into execution. Microdiscipline is not optional. It is mandatory. It is structural. It is a system. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. With daily microdiscipline established, you are prepared to advance. The next chapter will teach you how to talk back to yourself, how to counter the inner critic actively, and how to convert hesitation into deliberate self-directed action. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 7. Talk back to yourself. Your inner critic will not remain silent. It will speak. It will question. It will undermine. Hesitation, fear, doubt, procrastination. These are its tools. You cannot ignore it. You cannot hope it will disappear. The mind is conditioned to respond automatically, to obey the loudest voice. That is why passive observation is insufficient. That is why you must talk back. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey the critic. That is the key. Countering the inner voice is deliberate. It is not reactionary. It is not emotional. It is structural. You respond actively, not passively. When doubt arises, do not pause. Do not rationalize. Do not justify. Respond immediately with a system. Name the thought. Challenge the thought. Replace it with a phrase that enforces action and authority. Repetition embeds the neural pathway. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. Repeat silently. I am in control. I decide. I act. Step 1. Recognize the voice. Every doubt, hesitation, and fear is a signal. Observe it. Label it. Say silently, this is the critic. Awareness is the foundation. Naming the voice separates it from your identity. Externalization creates distance. Without distance, the voice dominates. With distance, you regain control. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 2. Prepare counterphrases. Short declarative statements. Simple, repetitive, forceful. Examples. I am in control. I decide. I act. Fear is a signal, not a command. Action precedes certainty. These phrases override automatic patterns of doubt. They rewire neural pathways. They enforce action. They neutralize hesitation. That is structural training. That is system design. That is authority over your mind. Step 3. Pair phrases with immediate action. Saying the words alone is insufficient. Words must be coupled with measurable movement. Open the document. Begin the task. Speak in the meeting. Take the first step. Execute now. Immediate action reinforces the phrase. Action converts thought into habit. Habit converts fear into control. Repetition compounds. Momentum builds. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Real-world examples demonstrate the power of self-directed language. Boxers rehearse victory phrases. Performers rehearse confidence phrases. Athletes repeat mantras before each round. Musicians repeat phrases before each performance. The purpose is identical: to silence doubt, to prevent hesitation, to override fear. Action becomes automatic. Confidence becomes structural. Execution becomes inevitable. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. Repeat silently. I am in control. I decide. I act. Step 4. Integrate this practice into daily life. Begin the day with declarative phrases. Confront fear immediately. Repeat phrases throughout the day whenever hesitation occurs. Embed them into routine tasks. Reinforce them before every challenge. Repetition creates automaticity. Automaticity reduces reliance on motivation. Motivation is fleeting. Structure is permanent. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. Do not allow subtlety to deceive you. The critic often hides behind logic. You are not ready. You need more time. What if you fail? Each phrase is a command disguised as advice. Recognize it. Label it. Replace it. Speak back with authority. Counter passivity with action. Counter hesitation with execution. Counter fear with repeated structural phrases. That is the system. That is discipline. That is power. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 5. Monitor reinforcement. Observe when phrases are effective. Track moments of hesitation. Track moments of doubt. Note the phrases that neutralize fear. Adjust wording if necessary. Customize the system. Make it precise. Make it automatic. Make it structural. Every encounter with the inner critic is an opportunity to strengthen your authority over your mind. Repetition compounds. Execution enforces compliance. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Internalize the mantra fully. Repeat it aloud or silently. Embed it into the brain's automatic responses. Every emergence of fear, hesitation, or doubt is met with, I am in control. I decide. I act. Pair the phrase with immediate, measurable action. Open the document. Take the first step. Begin execution. Repeat. Reinforce. Strengthen. Over time, the critic loses influence. Authority becomes internalized. Focus becomes habitual. Momentum becomes inevitable. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 6. Combine with previous systems. Use this method alongside named saboteurs, silence practice, trigger recognition, and microdiscipline. All systems are interconnected. Self-directed language reinforces previous training. Immediate action reinforces structural habits. Repetition reinforces neural pathways. Compounding creates mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Finally, understand the inevitability of resistance. The critic will return. It will vary its approach. Subtlety, disguise, delay, pressure. The mind will attempt to return to automatic responses. That is expected. That is normal. What is not optional is your response. Activate the system. Speak the phrases. Execute immediately. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Each repetition strengthens control. Each action reinforces authority. Each day compounds mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. With active self-talk mastered, you are prepared to advance. The next chapter will teach you how to remove the permission to procrastinate, how to enforce immediate action, and how to prevent hesitation from becoming habit. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 8. Remove the permission to procrastinate. Procrastination is consent. Every delay strengthens the voice that says, I'll do it later. Every postponement reinforces hesitation. Every rationalization empowers fear. That is the truth. The inner critic thrives on inaction. It gains authority every time you wait. That ends now. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey delay. That is the key. Step 1. Recognize the cost of postponement. Delay is not neutral. It builds momentum for the critic. It weakens your authority. It reduces competence. It amplifies doubt. The longer you wait, the more entrenched the patterns of fear and hesitation become. Understanding the consequence is non-negotiable. Awareness alone is insufficient. Recognition must be paired with action. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Step 2. Implement hard deadlines. Soft goals are invisible to the mind. They provide excuses. Hard deadlines create structural pressure. Place a specific date and time on every action. Write it down. Set alarms. Mark it in your calendar. Treat it as non-negotiable. Deadlines remove debate. Deadlines enforce compliance. Deadlines silence the critic. That is the rule. That is the system. Repeat silently. Action now silences regret forever. Step 3. Use accountability. Involve another person or system that monitors execution. An accountability partner, mentor, or team member. Share your plan. Commit publicly. External observation increases adherence. It converts intention into action. The mind resists external oversight less than internal hesitation. Accountability transforms procrastination into structured compliance. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 4. Create self-imposed rituals. Rituals structure action. They eliminate decision fatigue. Rituals remove ambiguity. Begin every task with a fixed routine. The same steps every time. For example, open the notebook, review tasks, set timer, begin immediately. Ritual enforces automatic execution. Ritual neutralizes hesitation. Ritual strengthens authority over the critic. Repeat silently. Action now silences regret forever. Step 5. Pair recognition with immediate action. Do not wait for readiness. Do not wait for certainty. The first step is the only step that matters. Open the document. Pick up the pen. Send the message. Start the project. Action reinforces authority. Action neutralizes delay. Action converts intention into habit. Repetition compounds. Momentum becomes inevitable. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Real-world examples illustrate the principle. Writers begin at a fixed time every morning. Athletes start training sessions without negotiation. Entrepreneurs execute first steps immediately, even when preparation feels incomplete. These individuals remove permission to procrastinate. They structure action. They enforce compliance. They neutralize hesitation. The system ensures execution. Excuses are irrelevant. Delay is eliminated. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Monitor triggers that encourage delay. Notice excuses, fears, and rationalizations. Track patterns. Identify moments when the inner critic whispers later. Label it. Respond immediately with action. Pair with mantra repetition. Action now silences regret forever. Reinforce neural pathways. Reinforce behavior. Repeat daily. That is structural adjustment. That is discipline. That is mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 6. Enforce consequences for inaction. Soft reminders are insufficient. Self-imposed penalties strengthen compliance. Missed deadlines require immediate corrective action. Extra effort. Extended practice. Additional work. Structural consequences enforce the habit. They convert procrastination into actionable discipline. Excuses are irrelevant. Delay is irrelevant. Only immediate action is valid. Repeat silently. Action now silences regret forever. The principle is universal. Every task, large or small, is subject to the system. Cleaning, writing, planning, learning, calling. Any task can be executed immediately. Delay always reinforces the critic. Immediate execution always strengthens authority. That is non-negotiable. That is structural. That is the law. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Consistency is mandatory. Daily repetition compounds power. One day of delay weakens progress. One day of immediate action reinforces momentum. 10 minutes today executed immediately outweighs an hour tomorrow executed hesitantly. Repetition embeds the habit. Repetition builds authority. Repetition silences the critic. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Integrate this into your broader systems. Combine trigger recognition, micro-discipline, self-talk, and naming the saboteur with immediate execution. Delay becomes impossible. Excuses are irrelevant. Hesitation is neutralized. Momentum compounds. Focus becomes habitual. Action becomes automatic. Authority becomes structural. Repeat silently. Action now silences regret forever. That is the principle. That is the rule. That is the system. Finally, understand the inevitability of temptation. Resistance will appear. Comfort will beckon. Rationalizations will arise. That is expected. That is normal. What is not optional is your response. Action must follow recognition. Execution must follow hesitation. Systems enforce compliance. Repetition strengthens the habit. Momentum builds. Excuses are irrelevant. Delay is irrelevant. Authority is structural. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. With procrastination eliminated, you are prepared to advance. The next chapter will teach you how to scale focus into extended periods, how to sustain attention under fatigue, and how to compound small actions into unstoppable flow. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 9. Feed the voice that empowers you. The inner voice is not fixed. It can be trained. It can be shaped. It can either destroy or empower. You have a choice. You decide which version dominates. Until now, you have contained the critic. You have named it. You have neutralized delay. You have acted despite hesitation. The next step is to cultivate a voice that supports, guides, and strengthens you. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. Step 1. Recognize the empowering voice. It is not imaginary. It is not abstract. It is the reflection of your capacity to act. It affirms focus. It reinforces competence. It reminds you of authority over action. It does not motivate through emotion. It enforces compliance through structure. It converts knowledge into execution. That is the rule. That is the system. That is the principle. Repeat silently. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. Step 2. Deliberately feed this voice. Do not allow random thoughts to dominate. Do not passively observe mental chatter. Engage the empowering voice. Speak to yourself intentionally. Counter hesitation with structured affirmation. Counter doubt with declarative authority. Counter fear with repeated acknowledgement of competence. Action paired with affirmation strengthens the neural pathways. Repetition compounds power. That is the law. That is the system. That is the principle. Entrepreneurs and high performers illustrate this system. They reframe challenges as opportunities rather than threats. They say, this problem reveals insight. This obstacle is a lesson. This setback is a signal to adapt. Each statement reinforces capacity. Each statement converts fear into structured response. Each statement strengthens authority. Every repetition creates permanence. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey fear. That is the key. Step 3. Pair empowerment with immediate action. Affirmation alone is insufficient. Words must be backed by measurable execution. Begin the task. Make the call. Write the page. Solve the problem. Execute within the framework of the empowering voice. Action validates affirmation. Action converts thought into habit. Habit converts empowerment into structural authority. Repetition compounds. Momentum becomes inevitable. Repeat silently. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. Step 4. Integrate the empowering voice into daily microdiscipline. Begin every session with deliberate self-talk. Confront challenges with affirmation. Reinforce every completed action with acknowledgement of competence. The brain internalizes patterns through repetition. Internalized patterns convert self-direction into automatic authority. Fear is minimized. Hesitation disappears. Confidence becomes structural. You have a choice. You act. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. Step 5. Combine empowerment with prior systems. Name the critic. Recognize triggers. Silence noise. Execute immediate action. Microdiscipline reinforces empowerment. Repetition solidifies authority. Momentum compounds. Deliberate self-talk amplifies control. Each system strengthens the other. The inner voice becomes a tool. The inner voice becomes a structural ally. That is the rule. That is the principle. That is the law. Repeat silently. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. The empowering voice is declarative. It does not seek permission. It does not justify. It does not debate. It commands. It directs. It enforces. Each phrase is precise, brief, and structured. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. Simple, repetitive, actionable, embedded in daily behavior, strengthened through execution, reinforced through repetition. That is the system. That is discipline. That is mastery. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 6. Observe results. Empowerment reshapes thought patterns. Confidence strengthens. Hesitation diminishes. Execution becomes automatic. Focus improves. Fear is neutralized. Opportunities are recognized. Obstacles are reframed. Challenges are addressed. Each success reinforces the empowering voice. Each repetition compounds structural authority. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. Step 7. Sustain the voice under pressure. Stress, fatigue, and high stakes amplify the inner critic. Do not surrender. Activate the empowering voice immediately. Repeat the phrases. Pair with deliberate action. Observe triggers of doubt. Neutralize them with affirmation and execution. Authority over your mind is non-negotiable. Repetition under pressure strengthens resilience. Repetition under pressure reinforces habit. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Finally, internalize the mantra fully. Embedded in every action, every thought, every decision. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. Speak it silently. Speak it aloud if necessary. Pair with immediate, measurable action. Repeat daily. Reinforce at every challenge. Repeat until automatic. Action converts affirmation into structural control. Authority over execution becomes permanent. Momentum becomes inevitable. That is the principle. That is the system. That is the law. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. With the empowering voice internalized, you are prepared to conclude your transformation. The final chapter will teach you how to integrate all systems, maintain control indefinitely, and build unstoppable attention, focus, and disciplined execution in every area of life. That is your next step. You have a choice. Act. That is the key. Chapter 10. Never let the saboteur return. Silence is temporary. Vigilance is permanent. That is the principle. You have contained the critic. You have named it. You have neutralized hesitation. You have built microdiscipline. You have trained your mind to act despite fear. You have fed the empowering voice. That is progress. But progress is not permanent without continuous maintenance. The saboteur will attempt to return. That is inevitable. You have a choice. You act. You do not obey it. That is the key. Step 1. Establish daily rituals. Rituals reinforce control. Morning reflection. End-of-day review. Each day begins with awareness of patterns, triggers, and intentions. Each day ends with assessment of execution and accountability. Ritual converts awareness into structure. Ritual converts intention into habit. Ritual strengthens authority over the inner critic. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. Step 2. Implement weekly mental audits. Review triggers, excuses, delays, and moments of hesitation. Examine where the critic attempted to regain control. Adjust strategies. Reinforce systems that worked. Eliminate ineffective approaches. Each audit compounds learning. Each audit strengthens control. Each audit converts vigilance into structural authority. That is the rule. That is the system. That is the law. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 3. Reinforce systems daily. Silence practice. Trigger recognition. Microdiscipline. Self-directed language. Immediate action. Empowering voice. All systems integrated. Each system strengthens the others. Habits become automatic. Execution becomes inevitable. Hesitation becomes rare. Fear diminishes. Momentum compounds. Authority becomes structural. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 4. Anticipate sabotage. The critic will disguise itself. Subtle doubt. Rationalization. Delay. Distraction. Stress. Fatigue. High stakes. These are opportunities for resurgence. Recognize them immediately. Activate rituals. Engage microdiscipline. Repeat empowering phrases. Execute immediate action. Repetition neutralizes intrusion. Repetition reinforces control. Repetition converts vigilance in a habit. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 5. Enforce accountability. Daily reflection is insufficient without structure. Share progress with yourself or others. Track compliance. Identify lapses. Apply corrective action immediately. External observation amplifies internal discipline. Accountability converts intention into measurable results. Excuses are irrelevant. Delay is irrelevant. Authority is structural. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. That is the rule. That is the system. That is the principle. Step 6. Maintain empowering self-talk. The inner critic will attempt subtle re-entry. Immediately activate the empowering voice. Repeat. I am focused. I am capable. I am unstoppable. Pair with action. Action validates affirmation. Action converts thought into habit. Habit converts empowerment into authority. Authority converts vigilance into permanent control. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. Step 7. Integrate reflection with planning. Daily reflection identifies patterns. Planning enforces execution. Identify high-risk periods. Assign structured responses. Apply microdiscipline during vulnerable moments. Anticipate triggers. Neutralize them proactively. The saboteur cannot regain power where systems exist. That is structural training. That is system design. That is mastery. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. Step 8. Reinforce consistency over intensity. Occasional bursts are temporary. Daily, repeated, structured vigilance creates permanence. Small actions repeated consistently compound. Habits enforce automatic execution. Microdiscipline converts intention into inevitable outcomes. Momentum becomes structural. Authority becomes permanent. Fear diminishes. Hesitation disappears. The critic loses all influence. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Step 9. Observe results over time. Mental clarity increases. Focus strengthens. Action becomes automatic. Productivity rises. Emotional control improves. Self-doubt diminishes. Momentum compounds. Empowerment is structural. Fear is contained. Authority is permanent. All systems integrated. You have a choice. You act. That is the law. That is the principle. That is the system. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. Step 10. Understand vigilance is a lifelong process. The critic may return in new forms. New challenges, stressors, or environments may trigger doubt. Do not underestimate subtlety. Do not surrender control. Reinforce systems daily. Reinforce rituals weekly. Reinforce empowering self-talk continually. Momentum compounds. Authority becomes structural. Execution becomes inevitable. The inner critic is contained. Permanently. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. Finally, internalize the mantra fully. Every day, every task, every decision. Repeat silently. I own my mind. My mind does not own me. Pair it with immediate, deliberate action. Reinforce with rituals. Reinforce with reflection. Reinforce with accountability. Action converts affirmation into permanent control. Repetition converts vigilance into automatic authority. Systems convert effort into mastery. Momentum becomes inevitable. That is the principle. That is the law. That is the system. You have a choice. You act. That is the key. If you have followed every chapter, applied every system, and repeated every mantra, you have transformed the way your mind operates. You have contained the saboteur. You have built authority. You have converted hesitation into action. You have created structural, permanent control over attention, focus, and execution. Momentum is inevitable. You are now the master of your inner world. That is your choice. That is your power. That is your system. And now, before we conclude, take this step. Subscribe to this channel. Every video reinforces systems, repetition, and mastery over the inner critic. By subscribing, you reinforce your commitment to discipline, focus, and authority over your mind. You act. You do not obey distraction. You maintain control. You have a choice. Act now.